You've just met James. There are 4 men named James in the New Testament. The one that wrote the book that we're going to study this morning, the book of James, was the brother of Jesus. As Mark chapter 6 and verse 3 says, he was one of 4 brothers and 2 sisters who rose to the challenge of Christ. James himself became the pastor of the church at Jerusalem. He is profiled in Acts chapter 12 and 15 and 21. The Apostle Paul speaks of him in Galatians chapter 2. And in this short letter that you hold before you this morning, he writes 108 verses. And in those 108 verses are no less than 50 direct commands to Christians. As he writes, he addresses his comments to the believers who have left Jerusalem because of Paul's persecution. These believers are called brethren and beloved. James reflects a good grasp of the Old Testament scriptures. He refers to all the books of the Pentateuch. He frequently alludes to Joshua and 1 Kings, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, and at least 7 of the minor 12 prophets. James truly reflected the Sermon on the Mount. Although he never quotes it, it seems like a reminiscence of a special time when he heard his brother speak. As we look at this book, I ask you a question. You want to grow in your spiritual life? You want to grow in classic Christianity? Listen to what this book talks about. It talks about confession of sin. It talks about how to have a prayer life that gets in touch with God. It talks about wealth, when it's right and when it's wrong. It leads us through the difficulty of temptation. It tells us about using our mouth, not for swearing, not for murmuring. It teaches us how to have godly patience and to not judge people by what they look like. It speaks about what it means to submit to God and how to avoid worldliness. It speaks about how strife begins in our life. And whether we're rich or poor, how we can have wisdom and joy in trials. It tells us to avoid earthly wisdom and to seek heavenly wisdom. It talks about how to have our tongues in line with God. And it speaks about how if we are going to teach what God expects, it tells the true role of faith and works and how we can be justified with God and what His law is and how we can live in liberty. It speaks to us of impartiality, of true worship of God, and of how our hearts can be regenerated. I'd like to walk you through this book. Starting in chapter 1, verse 2, the writer James says these precious words that we should find a faith that endures under trials. Look at verse 2. Consider it all joy, brethren, when you encounter various trials. Faith will endure trials, he says, down through verse 8, and we'll study that at a future time. Starting a little bit later down there in verse 12, he says that faith will understand and overcome temptations. Because it says in verse 12, blessed is the one who perseveres under trial. And when he has been approved, he will receive the crown of life, whom the Lord hath promised to those who love him. And when you're tempted, don't be troubled, because God will deliver us from that temptation as we look to him. Looking in verse 19, it says this, you know, beloved, that we should be swift to hear and slow to speak. Why is that? Because we should, verse 21, put aside filthiness and all that remains of wickedness and receive the word implanted. James teaches us that faith is receiving the true word and letting it get implanted in our hearts. Chapter 2, we'll see as we study this that faith is seeing like Jesus sees. He sees impartially. And starting in verse 14 of chapter 2, faith is living like Jesus lived, doing good. And in chapter 3, the first half of the chapter tells us how to control our tongues. And it says that we should know our tongue is like a fire, and we should keep it under control. In the last part of chapter 3, when we walk by faith, we receive wisdom from above. And truly it says in verse 17 of chapter 3 that when we are in tune with God, the wisdom from above that comes on our life is pure and peaceable and gentle and reasonable and full of mercy and good fruits. It's unwavering and without hypocrisy. And faith in chapter 4 is separating from the world and submitting to God. And finally in chapter 5, faith is patiently waiting for Christ's timing in our lives. Well, that's just a brief introduction to the book. James had looked at Christ, had considered the hardness of his heart and had turned in faith to the one he couldn't resist and bowed to him as his Lord, and he became Christ's servant. I hope this morning that we are servants of Christ.